What is far deadlier than most people realize? Story 1. You think you can trust your best friend, right? Well, I learned the hard way that trust is a luxury. My friend, let's call him Tim, came to me a few months ago saying he was short on rent. He was a wreck, asking me for $800 to avoid getting kicked out of his apartment. I'm no heartless person, so I lent him the money, no questions asked. He promised to pay me back by the end of the month. Fast forward 3 months, still nothing. I reached out countless times, but each time he came up with some lame excuse. Oh, I got hit with an unexpected expense, or I'll have it by next week. I'm sitting here, waiting like an idiot, when I find out Tim bought a new gaming setup, $12,200 worth. That's when I snapped. I shot him a message saying, "You know what? I'd love a gaming rig too, but apparently I'm not important enough for you to pay back." He had the nerve to reply, "You know how things are. I'll get to it when I can." That was the last straw. I blocked him everywhere. The next time I saw him, he didn't even apologize. Some people really think they can play you for a fool. Edit. So I finally got my money back. Not from Tim, but from his mom. Apparently, she's not too fond of the idea of her son being a freeloader. Go figure. Story 2. I'll never understand people who leave their kids in the car. It's not like it's the 90s anymore. This kind of thing should be common sense. So, I'm standing outside a grocery store last week when I noticed this woman in the parking lot. She's inside the store, and there's a toddler in her car. It's hot, probably 90 degrees outside, and this kid is just sitting there in a car seat, looking like he's about to melt. I'm not the type to mind my own business in situations like this, so I call the non-emergency number. The dispatcher tells me to wait and that they'll send someone over. 20 minutes pass. The kid's still in the car, sweating like a little pig. I'm about to break the window myself when the woman comes strolling out of the store, looking all calm and nonchalant, like she just did her weekly shopping. I straight up asked her how she could leave her child in the car, and she looked at me like I was the one overreacting. "It's just a few minutes," she says, like that justifies it. Honestly, some people are just reckless, and the worst part? She didn't even get in trouble for it. The cops basically just gave her a slap on the wrist. Sometimes the system really doesn't care about the right things. Story 3. It's crazy how the smallest decisions can change your entire life. A few years ago, I got an internship at this top-tier marketing agency. Super prestigious place. Everyone there was a genius, and I felt like I was walking on air. But one day, I overheard something that flipped my whole perspective. The CEO, let's call him Barry, was talking to a senior exec, and they were complaining about interns like me. Apparently, they thought I was too eager and too loud for the position. Keep in mind, I was working my tail off to prove myself. So I decided to confront Barry. I emailed him, explaining how I felt about the situation, and told him that if he didn't want me there, he should just say it outright. Fast forward to the next morning, Barry calls me into his office. My heart's racing. I'm thinking I'm done for. But instead he looks at me and says, "I respect the honesty, but you're right. This isn't a fit for you." Just like that, he let me go. The worst part? I was replaced by someone who didn't question the system. So now, I'm out of a job with no backup plan. And this eagerness of mine got me nowhere. Sometimes, the most honest things you do are the ones that get you fired. Story 4. I know everyone says never talk politics, but sometimes that's just impossible. My cousin Carl is a hardcore MAGA guy, like the kind of guy who wears a hat at Thanksgiving dinner. Yeah, that Carl. I never really cared about politics, but at every family gathering, he's there, pushing his opinions down everyone's throat. So, one day, at my aunt's birthday party, he starts in again about how the world's gone soft, and the liberals are ruining everything. I'd had enough, so I told him to chill. But that only made it worse. Carl decided that I was the problem, and he started calling me a liberal snowflake. The thing is, I'm not even remotely political. I just don't like hearing the same nonsense over and over. Long story short, we get into a shouting match in front of the whole family. My aunt tries to break it up, but we're both yelling about how America is screwed. The kicker? The next day, Carl calls me and says, "Hey, sorry about last night." I said, "No, Carl. I'm sorry you think yelling at me is going to make your point." That was the last time I saw him. Some people just can't take a hint. Story 5. I've never been so embarrassed in my life. So, my girlfriend and I are getting ready for this fancy dinner date. Like, we're talking reservations at the best place in town, dress shoes, the works. We get to the restaurant, and everything's going smoothly. The waiter seats us at a table with a view of the city skyline. Perfect, right? Well, everything was fine until the menu comes, and I realize I have no idea what half the stuff is. I'm talking gourmet food with names that sound like they're straight out of a different language. At one point, I'm just staring at the menu, pretending to read it, when my girlfriend asks what I'm getting. I panic and say, "I'll have the, lobster bisque." She looks at me like I'm insane. I didn't even know what bisque was. So, when the waiter comes back, I ask for the lobster bisque, and he gives me this weird look, like I'm some uncultured swine. It turns out the dish was like a soup, and I had no idea how to even eat it. My girlfriend just burst out laughing. I was so embarrassed, I could have crawled under the table. I'm pretty sure I'll never live that one down. Edit. I later found out the waiter told the entire staff about it. So I guess I'm famous now for being a disaster at fine dining. Story 6. You ever have one of those moments when you're so angry you can't even speak? Yeah, that happened to me a couple weeks ago. My boss, Mr. Thompson, is the type of guy who gives you 3 extra assignments and then pretends he's doing you a favor. So one day, he hands me this huge project that's supposed to be done in 2 days. "This is going to be great for your career," he says, grinning like he's some kind of motivational speaker. 2 days later, I turn it in. On time, obviously. And I'm expecting some recognition. Instead, he tells me, "It's okay, but it's not exactly what I had in mind." I'm standing there, trying to keep my cool, but he's giving me that condescending smile. I say, "So what exactly did you have in mind?" He looks at me, pauses, and says, "Well, I think we'll need to go in a different direction." What direction? You gave me 0 direction. If this guy had any self-awareness, he'd realize I was the one doing all the heavy lifting around here. Instead, I just smiled and nodded, knowing full well that I'm the one holding this whole place together. If I quit tomorrow, the entire department would collapse. But, whatever. Story 7. Some people never change. My high school bully, Jason, was one of those people. He made my life miserable for years, pushing me in the halls, calling me names, all that fun stuff. Fast forward 10 years. I'm working at a coffee shop, and guess who walks in? Yeah, it's Jason, looking just as smug as he did back in the day. He doesn't recognize me at first, but I sure recognize him. He's in a fancy suit, all grown up and probably thinking he's hot stuff now. He orders a latte and goes to sit down. But here's the kicker. He leaves his credit card on the counter. And me? I'm not the type to let things slide. I took that card, swiped it for everything it was worth, and pocketed the change. Karma's a funny thing. He didn't realize it until later when his bank called, asking why he was spending so much money at the coffee shop. Moral of the story? Don't be a jerk in high school, because you never know when the universe is going to serve you a nice cold cup of payback. Story 8. I'll never understand people who act like their time is more valuable than everyone else's. I was waiting at this crowded coffee shop, trying to get some work done, when this lady walks in and skips the line like she owns the place. She just straight up waltzes to the counter and orders her drink like everyone else isn't waiting their turn. I'm the kind of person who will speak up in situations like this, so I casually say, "Hey, there's a line." She looks at me like I'm the problem. She goes, "I'm in a rush. I'm too important to wait." The barista, bless his heart, tells her she has to wait like everyone else, but she starts throwing a tantrum. It's almost funny how entitled some people are. Eventually, she storms out, and the best part? As she leaves, she trips over the door handle and spills her coffee all over her shirt. Karma's got a sense of humor, you know? Story 9. Here's a tip. Never let your friends borrow your car. I learned that the hard way last summer. My buddy Ethan needed a ride to this party, and his car was in the shop, so he asked to borrow mine. I trusted him. He's been my friend since college. A few hours later, I get a call from Ethan, but this time he's not asking for a ride. Instead, he says, man, I kinda got into an accident." Kinda? He says he was driving down the street when some guy pulled out in front of him. Fine, accidents happen, right? But when I get to the scene, I see my car smashed up in the front with the other guy's car totally fine. Turns out, Ethan wasn't paying attention and hit the brakes way too late. When I asked him why he didn't tell me he was having issues with his brakes, he just shrugged. I had to pay for the repair, and Ethan? He didn't even offer to help. After that, I didn't just stop lending him my car. I stopped talking to him altogether. Some people just can't take responsibility. Story 10. You ever have a moment when you realize that your worst nightmare is actually true? That's what happened to me last month. I've been dating this guy, Mike, for a few months. Everything seemed perfect. He's funny, caring, and he always listens when I talk about my day. But one day, I decided to check his phone. It wasn't even intentional. I left my phone at his place, and he handed me his to call mine. When I unlocked it, I saw a conversation between Mike and one of my best friends. It was not great. They were making fun of me, joking about how clingy I am and how I'd probably be the worst thing to ever happen to him if they stayed together. I felt like I was punched in the stomach. I confronted him about it, and he tried to lie, but it was all right there. He apologized, but I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at him the same way. He's out of my life now. But here's the thing. My best friend? She still hasn't apologized. Guess some people just aren't worth keeping around. Edit. So, funny story. My best friend reached out last week trying to apologize, but instead of a heartfelt apology, she just wanted to know if Mike was still single. Some people never change. Story 11. You ever get caught in a situation where you try to be nice and it totally backfires? That happened to me with my coworker, Kelly. She's one of those people who always acts like she's swamped, like she's drowning in work, but I'm convinced she's just terrible at managing her time. So one day, she asked me to help her with a project that I know she could have done herself. She says, "I'm so overwhelmed. I don't know how to get this done." And being the good person I am, I agree to help. We're talking hours of me going through all her files and organizing stuff she should have done days ago. I finish it up, thinking I'll get a thank you, or at least some recognition. But instead, she turns around and takes credit for all my work in front of the boss. She's like, "I'm so proud of the progress I made with this project, thanks to everyone's effort." Meanwhile, I'm sitting there like, really? Everyone's effort? The worst part? She never even mentioned me by name. I've never been more livid in my life. Now I'm planning my revenge, and trust me, it's going to be sweet. I'm not sure how, but I'll make sure she knows never to mess with me again. Story 12. So, a few months ago, I made the mistake of trusting a friend with something important. Her name's Julia, and she's one of those people who promises she'll totally help you out, but always ends up leaving you hanging. I asked her to look after my dog for the weekend while I went on a trip. I gave her detailed instructions, left enough food, and even reminded her twice before I left. When I got back, my dog was nowhere to be found. I called Julia, freaking out, and she finally answered. She told me my dog ran away during the walk, and she didn't know where he went. Naturally, I was devastated. I spent hours looking around the neighborhood, knocking on doors, posting flyers. 2 days later, I get a call from a shelter. They found my dog. But here's the kicker. They said he had a new collar on. Apparently, Julia had bought a new one without telling me. When I confronted her, she said, "Oh, I thought he might get lost, so I figured it'd be better to upgrade his collar." I was furious. How could she not even tell me? To top it off, when I asked her why she didn't tell me sooner, she just shrugged and said, "I didn't think you'd care." Safe to say, Julia and I don't speak anymore. Story 13. You ever just know something's off, but you can't put your finger on it? That's how I felt the entire time I worked at this marketing firm last year. I was the new guy, just trying to keep my head down and get through the day, but there was always this weird vibe in the office. People would be talking behind my back, and when I'd ask about it, they'd just smile and act like nothing was going on. Then one day, I overheard my boss talking to one of the senior designers. He was saying, "We need to give him some hope. Like, let him think he's doing well, so he doesn't leave yet." It hit me like a ton of bricks. They were keeping me around just long enough to fill the position, but had no intention of ever hiring me full-time. I was just the guy for now. That was it for me. I walked up to my boss, handed in my resignation, and told him, "Thanks for the hope, but I'm done here." The look on his face was priceless. A month later, I found out that they actually did try to offer me a permanent position. But by then, I was already way out the door. Sometimes, knowing your worth means walking away. Story 14. So, I've been working at this small coffee shop for about a year, and it's usually a pretty chill place, until a certain customer started coming in. This guy, let's call him Steve, would come in every morning for his regular black coffee. Fine, whatever. But here's the catch. He always made a scene about the temperature. Every time, without fail, he would take a sip, then loudly exclaim, "This coffee is too hot," and send it back. We'd remake it, and within minutes, he'd complain again. We started to think he was just doing it for attention. So one morning, I decided to mess with him. I made his coffee extra hot, then waited for him to take a sip. Sure enough, he did the whole routine. "This is too hot. It's unbearable." But this time, I didn't take it back. I just smiled and said, "Sorry about that, sir. Unfortunately, we only serve unbearable coffee here." He stared at me for a second, clearly not expecting any resistance, then stormed out without a word. That was the last time Steve came in. Honestly, the best part of that day was the rest of the regulars cheering for me. Sometimes, standing up to annoying customers feels better than getting a tip. Story 15. I have this friend, Greg, who always acts like he's the smartest person in the room. It's like a superpower of his, being obnoxiously over-the-top smart about absolutely everything. So, a few months ago, we're having this discussion about who's the best superhero. Greg naturally starts talking about how Batman is superior to every other hero, even though we all know he's just a rich guy with gadgets. I try to explain that Superman, with all his powers, would totally wreck Batman, but Greg's not having it. He's convinced that Batman is the true hero. So I decide to pull a fast one. I told him, "Fine, but let's be real. If you had to choose one hero to fight for you, would you pick Batman or Superman?" Greg, with his usual arrogance, picks Batman. I smile, then say, "Well, good luck getting Batman to stop a bullet with his bare hands." I swear, his face dropped. He tried to laugh it off, but you could tell I'd gotten under his skin. The best part? A few days later, Greg texts me, "You know what? You're right about Superman. I guess even the smartest people can learn a thing or two sometimes." Edit. So, I got a text from Greg last night. Apparently, he's been rewatching every Superman movie now. Not sure if that's progress or just the start of his new obsession, but I'll take it. Story 16. Ever had one of those days where everything just falls apart? That was my Friday. I woke up late for work, obviously, spilled coffee on my shirt while getting in the car, and had to listen to my boss drone on about the importance of punctuality, as if he wasn't the one who hired me. But that wasn't the worst part. Around lunchtime, I get a call from my ex, Sarah. She's like, "I need to talk." I wasn't ready for this. She had been ghosting me for weeks, and now she's calling? So, I reluctantly agreed to meet her after work. Fast forward to us sitting in this dingy diner, and she starts going on about how she missed me and that she made a mistake. I'm thinking, okay, is this some kind of emotional manipulation? I was about to tell her to just go, but then she hits me with, "I'm pregnant." My heart stopped. We had never even discussed kids, and now this? I asked, "Is it mine?" And she just stared at me, not answering. That's when I realized she didn't know. I'm not proud of it, but I walked out. It was like a bad sitcom episode. That night, I ended up getting pizza alone and thinking about how life can throw a curveball, and sometimes it's best not to try and catch it. Story 17. So, there's this guy, Kevin, who lives down the street from me. Every time I walk by his house, he waves like we're best friends. But here's the kicker. Every time I wave back, he just stares at me like I'm some kind of weirdo. It's the strangest thing. A few weeks ago, I was walking my dog, and I see Kevin out on his porch. He waves, I wave back, and then he asks, "How's your dog doing?" I'm thinking, okay, nice casual chat, right? But then he just goes on about how his dog had run away a while ago. I'm feeling bad for him, trying to be supportive, but he just keeps going on and on about it. The weird part? He didn't even have a dog. I mean, I've seen him outside all the time, and never once did I see him walking a dog. So I ask, wait, when did you have a dog? And he just gets super awkward, changing the subject real quick. Fast forward a few days later, I find out he had been trying to get my dog's attention for weeks, tossing treats at it whenever he saw me walking by. I had no idea what to think about that. All I know is, Kevin's the kind of guy who might look harmless, but there's definitely something weird going on behind those eyes. Story 18. You ever catch your parents in a lie so big, it makes you question everything? That's what happened to me last month. My parents have always been kind of old-fashioned, so when they told me they never had a problem with me dating whoever I wanted, I believed them. Big mistake. So I start dating this guy, Sam, who's a little on the wild side. Not like criminal wild, but you know. He has tattoos, rides a motorcycle, listens to rock music. I honestly didn't think it was a big deal. Well, the minute my parents meet Sam, they get so uncomfortable. My mom keeps giving me these side-eye glances, and my dad practically starts interrogating him. Finally, I pull my parents aside and ask what's going on. That's when they finally drop the bombshell. "We just don't think he's the right type for you." What does that even mean? They act all shocked when I call them out on it. But here's the kicker. My mom admits, "We just never approved of him because he's not from the right background." I'm like, what? Since when did we care about backgrounds? It turns out they had been secretly vetting every guy I dated without telling me. To say I was livid is an understatement. I'm still dating Sam, but now I'm also figuring out how to stand up for myself without feeling guilty. Story 19. A couple months ago, I was at this party thrown by my college buddy Aaron. Aaron's one of those guys who throws these epic parties, always with the promise of free booze and endless fun. The night's going fine, people are laughing, dancing, and everything's chill. But then I notice this guy, let's call him Steve, hovering near the corner of the room. He's acting all sketchy, like he's up to something. I didn't think much of it until he comes up to me and says, "Hey, I bet I can beat you in a game of poker." Now, I'm no poker expert, but I've played a few rounds in my day, so I agree. We sit down, and he starts talking all this trash about how he's been playing poker since he was 12, how he's unbeatable. He's really hyping himself up. Fast forward about 30 minutes, I'm sitting with a stack of chips in front of me, and Steve looks like he's about to cry. The guy didn't even know how to bluff properly. In the end, I take all his chips, and he just stares at me, completely speechless. Then, out of nowhere, he accuses me of cheating and storms out. As he's leaving, Aaron stops him and says, "If you can't handle losing to a beginner, maybe you shouldn't be playing poker." I'll never forget that night. Steve went from unbeatable to totally embarrassed in less than an hour. Story 20. So, I've been living in this apartment complex for almost a year now, and up until recently, everything was fine. That is, until I found out my neighbor, Karen, had been spying on me for months. Yeah, spying. I always thought it was weird when I'd see her staring at me through the blinds whenever I left my apartment. But I brushed it off. One day, I decided to go out on my balcony and have a coffee, trying to get some fresh air. Of course, as I'm sitting there, Karen's doing the same thing on her balcony. She says, "Hey, I noticed you always leave around 8 a.m. and come back around 6 p.m. I'm like, "How do you know that?" And she just shrugs and goes, "Oh, I've been keeping track." No big deal, right? Except it was. Turns out Karen had been writing down my every move, including when I went to the store, when I had visitors, and even when I walked my dog. She had this entire logbook filled with my daily routine. I felt violated, to be honest. I asked her why she was doing it, and she just said, "You never know who's moving in next." I immediately called the building manager and had a talk with them. Karen's been a lot quieter since, but now I make sure to draw my curtains. Some people are seriously next-level creepy. Eat it. Karen's been sending me these random friendly texts now, asking if I need anything from the store. I'm not sure what she's up to, but I'm definitely keeping an eye on her. Story 21. I've always had a bad feeling about my neighbor, Dave. He's the type of guy who'll smile at you like he's your best friend, but there's just something off about him. I usually just avoid him, but one day he caught me outside and started chatting me up about my car. He was asking a ton of weird questions like where I'd gotten it, how long I'd had it, and if I planned on keeping it for a while. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice, but then he said something strange. "I could help you get a better deal if you ever decide to upgrade." I didn't respond, just awkwardly laughed it off. The next day, my car was broken into. The lock was completely messed up, and nothing was stolen. Just the lock. I called the cops, but they couldn't really do anything. The weird thing is, Dave didn't even seem surprised when I told him about it. In fact, he acted too calm. I know I shouldn't jump to conclusions, but it felt like he was waiting for me to find out. Since then, I've kept a closer eye on him. I can't prove it, but I'm certain Dave had something to do with it. And now, every time I see him, I wonder if he's just waiting for his next opportunity. Story 22. Ever get stuck in a conversation with someone who's way too comfortable telling you their life story? That happened to me last weekend. I was at a friend's party, and I ended up talking to this guy, Mark, who was absolutely obsessed with his high school days. Every time I tried to steer the conversation towards something else, he'd jump back to the good old days. He kept telling me how he was the biggest thing in school, and how he used to be a star quarterback, and how everybody knew him. It wasn't even impressive. The guy was in his 30s, still wearing the same varsity jacket he'd gotten when he was 18. Finally, I had enough and asked him why he never tried to keep up with football or anything after high school. His face went completely blank. He started mumbling something about injuries and not having the time, but I could tell it was all a load of crap. At that point, I decided to be a little more blunt. "So, you peaked in high school, huh?" He didn't laugh, just stared at me for a minute. Then he got super defensive, saying, "You wouldn't understand. Some people just need more time to figure themselves out." I didn't respond, but I was thinking, "Yeah, buddy, I'm sure that's what it is." After that, I couldn't get away from him fast enough. Some people never grow out of high school, and it's exhausting. Story 23. A few years ago, I made the mistake of agreeing to a roommate situation with my cousin, Jenna. At first, everything seemed fine. She was easy to talk to, she had a steady job, and she was generally laid back. But after about a month of living together, things started to get weird. One night, I came home to find the entire apartment trashed. Clothes everywhere, food spilled all over the counter, and the trash piled up. I thought maybe there'd been a party, but when I asked her about it, she just shrugged it off and said she wasn't in the mood to clean. Over time, I realized she wasn't just lazy. She was deliberately messing with my stuff. One day, I came home to find my favorite jacket had a huge rip in it. I confronted her, and she just gave me this weird smile, like she was proud of it. Turns out, Jenna had been secretly sabotaging my things because she was jealous of me. She didn't want me to have anything nice. I don't know if I was just too naive or what, but when I found out, I packed my stuff and left. I couldn't live with someone who clearly wanted to see me fail. The worst part? She acted like nothing happened, and when I moved out, she said, "You'll be back." I haven't spoken to her since. Story 24. You ever try to help someone and it just blows up in your face? That's exactly what happened when I tried to help my friend Tim get a job. Tim's one of those guys who always seems to be struggling. Never keeps a steady job, always broke, and constantly complains about how unfair life is. So, when I found out about an opening at my work, I thought, why not help him out? I gave him the details, put in a good word with my boss, and told him to apply. He got the job, surprisingly. Everything was fine until he started acting like a total jerk. He'd show up late, make excuses for everything, and generally slack off. My boss started to notice, and of course, it was my recommendation that led to him being hired. The worst part? Tim starts complaining to everyone about how hard the work is and how I didn't warn him about the pressure. I finally had to pull him aside and tell him to either step up or leave. He gets all defensive and says, "This isn't what I signed up for." I told him he literally signed the contract, and if he couldn't handle it, he could go back to being unemployed. After that, he quit, and I'm left wondering why I even tried to help him. Some people just can't handle the real world. Story 25. I don't know what it is about certain people, but they just seem to think you owe them everything. That was the case with my old co-worker, Lisa. Lisa was the kind of person who would always act like she was doing everyone a favor by showing up to work. She'd casually talk about how much harder her job was compared to everyone else's and how lucky we were to have her around. But the thing was, she wasn't doing anything special. She always slacked off, left early, and passed her responsibilities to others without a second thought. One day, I'd had enough of her constant complaining. I pulled her aside and said, "You're not working any harder than anyone else here. We all have our own stuff to do." She looks at me with this smug expression, like she was about to school me on life. Instead, she says, "Well, maybe if I worked harder, you wouldn't have your job." I honestly didn't know what to say to that. Was she trying to threaten me? I ended up just walking away and reporting her to HR. The next week, Lisa was mysteriously gone. I don't know if it was my report or something else, but I never had to deal with her again. I guess sometimes you just have to put your foot down and let people know you won't let them walk all over you. Eat it. Apparently, Lisa found a new job, but I heard from a coworker she got fired after 2 weeks. Guess she didn't learn her lesson after all. Story 26. So, I've been living in the same apartment complex for a few years now, and I thought I knew my neighbors pretty well. That is, until one night when I got a knock on my door. It was Steve, the guy who lived 2 doors down. He's always been that quiet, somewhat creepy type who never really talks to anyone, but he caught me off guard this time. He was holding a box and said, "Hey, can you watch this for me? Just for a day or two. I'll be right back." I didn't know what to say. It was strange, but I didn't want to seem rude, so I agreed. About 3 days later, Steve still hadn't come back. I kept the box in my closet, thinking he'd just be gone for a little while longer. But then I started to get nervous. The box was heavy, and the more I thought about it, the more weird it felt. One night, I decided to open it. Inside was a bunch of old clothes, along with a few bags filled with what looked like old paperwork, like personal paperwork. There were names I didn't recognize, addresses, and even photos of people who weren't Steve. I had no idea what was going on. I panicked and called the cops. By the time they arrived, Steve was back, acting like nothing happened. They searched his apartment and found all kinds of illegal stuff. He was arrested, and I haven't seen him since. Moral of the story? If someone asks you to hold the box, ask a few questions first. 327. I'll never forget the time I thought I was helping a friend out, only for everything to go sideways. My buddy Paul had just gone through a rough breakup, and I offered him a place to crash for a couple of days. He was a mess, barely eating, constantly drinking, and wallowing in self-pity. After a few days, he started getting weird. One night, I came home from work, and I found him going through my things. I'm talking my drawers, my bathroom, even my personal files. When I asked what he was doing, he just stared at me and said, "I was looking for something to do." I told him to knock it off, but he seemed off. A few days later, I noticed some of my stuff was missing. Small things, some cash, a couple of gadgets, and even my spare keys. At first, I thought I'd misplaced them, but then I caught him red-handed. I found a receipt for a new laptop, one that looked exactly like mine. I confronted him, and he broke down, saying he needed it because he didn't have the money for a new one. I couldn't believe it. After everything, he still tried to justify it. I told him he had to leave, and honestly, I haven't spoken to him since. Sometimes, you just can't help people who don't want to help themselves. Story 28. A few months ago, I was invited to a family reunion that I wasn't really excited about, but you know how it is, family pressure. So I show up at this thing, and immediately I'm hit with the usual. Awkward hugs, the uncomfortable small talk, and the "so what are you up to these days?" questions. But then, out of nowhere, my cousin, Maria, pulls me aside and asks me if I know what happened to my Uncle Peter. I was confused because Uncle Peter was always the fun guy, the one who told crazy stories and would buy you drinks when you were underage. Maria tells me that he had disappeared months ago, just vanished. Nobody knew where he went, but she thought I might know. Apparently, he'd been acting strange in the weeks before he went missing, showing up at random places, talking about some big score he was going to make. Nobody knew what he was talking about. A few days later, I get a call from the police. They'd found Uncle Peter, or what was left of him, in the woods not far from where our family reunion was held. The authorities were still piecing together the details, but it turns out my uncle had gotten caught up in something dangerous. The worst part? Maria didn't even seem surprised. I think she knew more than she let on. The whole thing was messed up. Story 29. You ever get stuck in a group chat with a bunch of people who just won't stop talking? It all started when my friend Jeff decided to create a party planning chat for our friend group. The idea was good at first. Organize a party, get everyone involved and all that, but then Jeff went and turned it into a monster. Every day, it was non-stop notifications. Who's bringing what? Who can drive? What time should we start drinking? At first, it was manageable, but then it got ridiculous. People were arguing over the tiniest things, like whether we should have beer or wine, or if we needed a bounce house. The worst part? Every time I tried to mute the chat, someone would text me directly like, "Why are you ignoring the chat?" So, I stayed in it, watching this train wreck unfold in real time. I finally had enough when Jeff posted, "What about having a magician?" And everybody was like, "Yeah, great idea." They seriously wanted a magician at a party for 20-somethings. That's when I snapped. I posted, "Guys, it's a party, not a circus. No one cares about the magician." Everyone went dead silent for a few hours. Jeff texted me, asking if I was okay. I didn't reply. Long story short, the party happened without a magician, and surprisingly, it was one of the best ones we've ever had. Sometimes a little chaos makes things interesting. Story 30. I recently had a run-in with a guy at the grocery store that made me rethink everything about human nature. I was just there, trying to grab a few essentials for the week, when this guy, let's call him Rick, bumped into me in the aisle. No big deal, I apologized. But then Rick goes on this tirade about how rude I was for not watching where I'm going. I'm standing there thinking, okay, chill out, it was an accident. But he starts getting louder, telling me I was entitled and that I wasn't even sorry. He then pushes his cart in front of mine and tries to block me from leaving the aisle. At this point, I'm done with this guy. I calmly ask, "Are you seriously going to do this in a public place?" That just set him off even more. He starts yelling about how people like me have no respect for others and that I probably think I own the store. I'm starting to think he's got some issues, but I just tell him, "Listen, if you're going to throw a tantrum over a shopping cart, I'm leaving. Have a nice day." I walk away, but Rick follows me around the store for another 15 minutes, still giving me death stares. It's crazy to me how some people can't handle the smallest inconvenience without turning it into a full-blown scene. Edit. So, after the whole thing, I found out Rick's actually a regular at the store, and he's known for acting like that. Apparently, the staff dread him. I'm just glad I never ran into him again. Story 31. Last month, I decided to sell my old gaming console online. Seemed simple enough. Post some pictures, set a price, and wait for someone to buy it. Within an hour, I got a message from a guy who said he'd pick it up that evening. Great, right? Wrong. When he showed up, he started haggling hard. "Can you do half the price?" he asked, as if the console wasn't already a bargain. I stood my ground, but he kept pushing. Finally, he agreed to the full price, but said he didn't have cash and wanted to use a money transfer app instead. I hesitated, but he seemed legit, so I agreed. Big mistake. He showed me a fake confirmation screen and left with my console. By the time I realized the money never came through, he was long gone. I felt like such an idiot for falling for it. I reported it to the app, but they said they couldn't do anything. Lesson learned. Always wait for the actual payment to clear before handing over anything valuable. Story 32. A few weeks ago, my roommate, Ben, came home with this massive box and wouldn't tell me what was inside. He just said, "It's a surprise." Knowing Ben, I figured it was some stupid gadget or overpriced tech he didn't need. Fast forward to the next morning, and I wake up to the sound of loud music blasting from the living room. I walk out, and there's Ben, wearing a VR headset, swinging a controller around like he's in a boxing match. Turns out, the surprise was a VR system he bought with my credit card. I couldn't believe it. He swore it was an accident, saying he meant to use his own card and would pay me back. I told him he had 24 hours to get my money, or I was reporting the charge. He managed to pay me back, but now, every time I see that VR headset, I get annoyed all over again. Story 33. You ever find out something about a family member that makes you see them in a completely different light? That's what happened with my Uncle Greg. For years, he was the cool uncle, the one who took us fishing, told the best stories, and always had some exciting adventure to share. But last Christmas, he let something slip after a few too many drinks. Apparently, Greg had been fired from his job years ago for stealing company property. Not just small stuff. He was caught with thousands of dollars worth of equipment in his garage. I couldn't believe it. When I asked him why he did it, he just laughed and said, "Everyone was doing it. I just got caught." Suddenly, all those adventures he used to tell us about felt more like excuses to cover up what was really going on. I haven't looked at him the same way since. Story 34. Last weekend, I was at a diner when I saw a guy walk in with a giant bouquet of flowers. He looked nervous, like he was about to propose or something. He sat down at a table for two and kept checking his phone. After about 15 minutes, it was clear he was waiting for someone who wasn't coming. I felt bad for the guy, but what happened next made it worse. The waitress came over and asked if he wanted to order, and he said, "No, I'll wait." Another 30 minutes passed, and still no one showed up. Finally, he got up, left the flowers on the table, and walked out without saying a word. The whole thing was so heartbreaking, and I couldn't stop thinking about it all day. Sometimes people's lives are way sadder than they let on. Story 35. I thought I was a good judge of character, but my ex, Laura, proved me wrong. We dated for a year, and I thought everything was fine, until she started acting really secretive. She'd go out late at night, wouldn't tell me where she was going, and always kept her phone locked. I tried not to overthink it, but one night, I got curious and looked through her social media. Turns out, she had a whole other boyfriend she'd been seeing for months. The guy didn't even know about me. I confronted her, and she had the audacity to act like I was the one in the wrong for invading her privacy. I broke up with her on the spot, but the whole thing left me questioning my ability to trust anyone again. Edit. Funny enough, a few weeks later, her other boyfriend messaged me. Turns out she cheated on him too. We ended up grabbing a beer together and bonding over how awful she was. Life's weird like that. Story 36. A few months ago, I thought I had found the perfect place to live. It was a nice little apartment, cheap, with a great view, and in a relatively quiet neighborhood. What could go wrong, right? Well, a week after I moved in, I started noticing some strange things. At night, there would be loud knocking on my door, but when I opened it, no one was there. The first few times, I just assumed it was a prank, but then it started happening more frequently. I asked the neighbors about it, but they just gave me weird looks and said they didn't hear anything. Then one night, I heard whispering outside my window. I peered through the blinds and saw a figure standing in the shadows. I froze. I thought I was imagining things, but then I saw them wave at me, like they knew I was watching. I immediately called the cops. When they arrived, the figure was gone, but they found a hidden camera on the side of my building aimed directly at my window. The cops said it was probably someone who had been spying on me for weeks. I moved out the next day. Sometimes you think you found the perfect place to live, but you never know what's really lurking behind closed doors. Story 37. A few years ago, my best friend Ryan came to me with this insane business idea. He wanted to start a subscription box service, just random stuff like snacks, gadgets, and quirky items, all for a monthly fee. At first, I thought he was just messing around, but when he showed me his plans, I was shocked. He had everything laid out, from the target audience to how to get suppliers on board. It sounded like a gold mine, and he asked if I wanted to invest. I was hesitant, but I figured, why not? Big mistake. The first few months were great until the product started going missing. Turns out, Ryan was pocketing a portion of the subscription money and buying way cheaper products than what he'd promised. When I confronted him, he acted like nothing was wrong. He said, "It's just business, man, chill." I couldn't believe it. I ended up losing my investment, and our friendship never really recovered. Some people will do anything to make a quick buck, even if it means stabbing their friends in the back. Story 38. It all started with a casual conversation at work. My coworker Sarah mentioned that she was selling some old furniture and asked if I was interested. I told her I didn't really need anything, but she insisted that I check out her stuff. I agreed to take a look. When I showed up at her place, she had an entire room full of things. Couches, lamps, artwork, and all of it looked brand new. She offered everything for a ridiculously low price, so I bought a few items, including a coffee table. Big mistake. A week later, I started noticing that the coffee table looked different than when I bought it. It started changing color, like it was getting darker. And then it started smelling. It was like a mix of old wood, dust, and something off. I did some digging and found out that the coffee table had been part of a hoarder's estate sale. Apparently, it came with a history. Some of the furniture had been left untouched for decades. The worst part? The smell wouldn't go away. I had to toss it, but not before telling Sarah what I'd found out. She laughed and said, "Yeah, I should have told you about that. My bad." I never bought anything from her again. Story 39. Last month, I went on a blind date. I wasn't expecting much, but the girl seemed cool enough in her profile pics. We met up at a coffee shop, and things started off pretty normal. She was funny, seemed smart, and we hit it off immediately. But then, halfway through the date, she started talking about her ex. Not just talking, ranting about him. How he was a total jerk and ruined her life, blah blah blah. I tried to steer the conversation in another direction, but she kept going. After an hour of hearing about how awful he was, I decided to call it a night. I paid for the coffee and told her it was nice meeting her. As I stood up to leave, she grabbed my arm and said, "You're not just going to leave, are you? I mean, we're having such a good time." I pulled my arm away and said, "Actually, yeah, I am." As I walked out, I heard her mutter, "You're just like him." I never went on a blind date again. Lesson learned. If someone spends an entire date talking about their ex, run, Tori 40. I was in the middle of a huge project at work when I noticed something strange happening with my emails. Every time I would send something important, I'd get an automatic bounce back saying, "Message could not be delivered." At first I thought it was just a glitch, but then it kept happening. I double-checked everything, and sure enough, the emails I sent were going through to the wrong people. People who weren't even in my contact list. I started getting paranoid and checked the email addresses, and I found that some of them were suspicious. Turns out, my work email had been hacked. Someone had access to my account, and they were sending out sensitive documents to who knows where. I immediately reported it to IT, and after a full investigation, they found out that the hacker had been someone within the company, a guy I worked with daily. He had been using my account to send out confidential information to competitors. The worst part? He acted completely normal around me. It was like nothing happened. He was fired, but the damage had already been done. Eat it. I later found out that he wasn't the only one involved. Turns out there was a whole ring inside the company. They were sharing info with outside contractors for months. It was insane. Story 41. A while ago, I agreed to go on a road trip with a couple of friends. We were planning a 3-day camping trip in the mountains, so I was expecting some time away from the usual stress of work. The first day was great. Scenic views, good food, and decent hiking. But on the second day, things started to get weird. We were hiking up a trail when we stumbled upon an old cabin. It didn't look like anyone had lived there for years, but something about it felt off. My buddy Mike, always the adventurer, wanted to check it out. As we walked closer, we saw that the windows were covered with sheets. We decided to leave it alone, but then we heard something. Footsteps from inside. We froze. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a man in a torn flannel shirt stepped out, glaring at us. He looked disheveled, like he hadn't seen a mirror in months. "What are you doing here?" he growled. We quickly backed off, muttering something about just passing by. As we hiked back down, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching us. When we finally got back to the car, Mike insisted we leave immediately. He didn't have to convince us twice. I still don't know who that guy was or why he was out there, but I've never gone hiking in that area again. Story 42. It all started with a simple trip to the grocery store. I was just picking up some essentials when I ran into an old friend, Derek. We hadn't talked in years, but we caught up for a few minutes and swapped phone numbers. A couple of days later, Derek sent me a message asking if I wanted to hang out. I figured, why not? We went out for drinks and everything seemed fine, but then he started acting a little off. He kept staring at me weirdly, almost like he was sizing me up. It got worse when we went to another bar, and I noticed that he was taking pictures of me. I asked him what he was doing, and he just shrugged it off, saying, "Just some memories, you know?" I didn't think much of it until the next day when I noticed a strange post on my social media. A picture of me from that night with a caption that read, "Remember this, you'll need to." I tried to ignore it, but he kept sending me random pictures and weird messages like, "You don't remember the bet, do you?" And, "I never forget a deal." I blocked him after that, but it still freaks me out. What did I get myself into? Story 43. I work in a small office with a bunch of people I don't really know that well. But one person, Kate, always stood out. She had this weird energy about her, constantly smiling, way too friendly, but something felt off. I thought she was harmless, until one day I overheard a conversation she was having with a client. She was talking about how she knew everything about me and could make things happen if the client agreed to certain terms. I thought she was just being over the top, but then I noticed something disturbing. She was talking about things no one at work should have known. It was like she had been stalking people. Later that day, I asked a few coworkers about her, and everyone was either uncomfortable or outright scared of her. Turns out, Kate had been researching our personal lives and using that info to manipulate clients into signing deals. One of my coworkers even mentioned that Kate had once blackmailed a client into buying something they didn't need. I confronted Kate, but she just smiled and said, "You wouldn't understand. It's just business." I went to HR, but when they investigated, they found nothing. It was like she was untouchable. It still gives me chills thinking about how someone so friendly could be so dangerous. Story 44. I'm a fairly private person, so when my landlord asked me to meet him at his office to sign a new lease agreement, I was a little confused. I'd always paid my rent on time and nothing seemed unusual. When I arrived, he was acting a bit strange, nervous even. He offered me a coffee and said, "I think it's time you knew a little more about the place you're renting." I wasn't sure what he meant, but I sat down and listened. That's when he dropped the bomb. Apparently, the building I was living in had a dark history. There had been multiple tenants before me who disappeared under weird circumstances. He casually mentioned that the apartment I was renting had been the site of several unexplained deaths, but that it was nothing to worry about. I laughed it off, assuming he was just trying to freak me out for some weird reason. That night, I had the strangest dream. I was standing in the hallway outside my apartment, and I heard whispers. When I woke up, I checked the hallway. Nothing. But later that week, I found out that my neighbor had just moved out without telling anyone. I had no idea what was going on, but I started to feel a little paranoid. After a few weeks, I found a new place and moved out. Sometimes I still think about that office meeting and wonder if I made the right call leaving. Edit. Funny thing, when I went to pick up my security deposit, the landlord acted like he didn't even remember our conversation. Made me wonder if it was all part of some twisted game. Story 45. A few months ago, my friend Tom invited me to a weekend getaway in a cabin. I've known Tom for years, and I thought it'd be a good way to escape the grind. The first night was a blast. Fire pit, beers, some stories around the campfire. But then, things took a strange turn. Around midnight, Tom asked if I wanted to go for a walk in the woods. I wasn't really in the mood, but he was insistent. So, reluctantly, I agreed. As we walked deeper into the forest, I noticed something strange, a trail of fresh footprints. The weird thing? They didn't look like animal tracks, and they weren't Tom's. I told him I thought we should head back, but he ignored me and kept walking. We kept following the footprints for what felt like forever, until we reached this old, decrepit shack. Tom smiled and said, "This is it. The spot." I had no idea what he was talking about. We went inside, and that's when I saw it. A bunch of old, creepy photos pinned to the wall. They were pictures of me and Tom, but taken before we'd even met. I freaked out and demanded an explanation. Tom just looked at me, laughing. "I'm not your friend, man. I've been watching you for months." I bolted out of there and never spoke to him again. Edit. It turns out Tom wasn't just some random guy. I later found out he had been following me for years. He had literally been in my life under different aliases. Creepy stuff.